when a billionaire tech CEO dragged his heavyset wife of 15 years into a Chicago courtroom. He expected a quick slaughter. He wanted to leave her with absolute zero. But Richard didn't know his quiet, underestimated wife was holding a secret that would obliterate his entire empire. Listen closely. The heavy mahogany doors of the Cook County Circuit Court swung shut, sealing the courtroom in a suffocating silence. The air was thick with the kind of tension that only millions of dollars and a bitter betrayal could produce. At the plaintiff's table sat Richard Kensington, the golden boy of Chicago's booming data analytics sector, impeccably groomed, clad in a custom-tailored charcoal brownie suit. Richard looked less like a man fighting for his marital assets and more like a predator about to feast. Beside him sat his lead counsel, Gregory Fisk. Fisk was a legal shark, notorious in the high-stakes divorce circuits for his ruthlessness. He made a career out of obliterating spouses, leaving them with pennies on the dollar, and he clearly expected today to be no different. Across the aisle at the defense table sat Beatrice Kensington. Beatrice was the heavyset woman, dressed in a modest, well-cut navy blue dress. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap. For 15 years she had been the invisible pillar behind Richard's meteoric rise. While he graced the covers of tech magazines and gave charismatic keynote speeches, Beatrice stayed in the shadows. Society, and indeed Richard himself, had long ago decided what a woman of her size and quiet demeanor was worth. Nothing. To Richard, she was an embarrassment, a relic from his humble beginnings before the massive success of Kensington Data Solutions. He had spent the last 5 years slowly icing her out of his public life, embarrassed by her weight, her lack of interest in high society galas, and her refusal to fit into the mold of a trophy wife. Now he was trying to ice her out of their fortune entirely. Judge Thomas R. Harrison, a stern man with no patience for courtroom theatrics, adjusted his glasses and looked down from the bench. Mr. Sentis, Mr. Vision One Fisk, you may proceed with your opening statement. Fisk stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced theatrical flair. He paced slowly toward the center of the room. Your Honor, Fisk began, his voice dripping with polished condescension. We are here today to resolve a matter of simple mathematics and undeniable fact. My client, Richard Kensington, built an $800 million tech empire from the ground up. Through his sheer genius, relentless work ethic, and singular vision, he created Kensington Data Solutions. Fisk paused, letting his eyes drift over to Beatrice with a look of barely concealed disgust. And then there is the defendant, Beatrice Kensington, a woman who, for the entirety of their 15-year marriage, has contributed absolutely nothing to the marital estate. She has not held a job in a decade. She has not attended a single corporate function in 6 years. She has, frankly, spent my client's hard-earned wealth on a sedentary lifestyle, refusing to uphold the basic public image required of a corporate partner. Beatrice didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on the legal pad in front of her. Beside her, her attorney, Joanne Clifford, a sharp-eyed, understated lawyer, remained perfectly still. Your Honor, Fisk continued, his volume rising, we have provided the court with a post-nuptial agreement signed by the defendant 4 years ago. In it, there is a clear morality and lifestyle clause, a clause that the defendant has flagrantly violated through her absolute refusal to participate in the public and social maintenance of the Kensington brand. Because of this egregious breach, my client is exercising his right to void the standard 50-50 split of assets. We are offering a generous severance of $100,000 and the deed to their secondary cabin in Wisconsin. The rest of the estate, including 100% of the equity in Kensington Data Solutions, rightly belongs to its sole architect, Richard. A low murmur rippled through the sparse gallery. $100,000 out of an $800 million fortune. It wasn't just a divorce settlement, it was a financial execution. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He leaned over and whispered something into Fisk's ear, and both men shared a quiet chuckle. Richard truly believed he had won. He believed that because Beatrice was overweight, quiet, and largely unseen, she was also stupid. He assumed that when he shoved that post-nuptial agreement in front of her 4 years ago, buried in a stack of mortgage refinancing documents, she had just blindly signed it out of lazy obedience. He assumed she didn't read it. He assumed she didn't know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He assumed she didn't know about the young 20-something fitness model he had been secretly funding in a penthouse on the Gold Coast. Most importantly, Richard assumed that he was the actual brains behind Kensington Data Solutions. When it was Joanne Clifford's turn to speak, she didn't pace. He stood up from her chair, adjusted her microphone, and looked directly at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," Joanne said, her voice calm and remarkably devoid of anger. "Mr. Fisk has painted a very compelling picture of a lone genius and his lazy, burdensome wife. It's a narrative that my client, Beatrice, has patiently endured for over a decade. It is true that Beatrice has not attended high society galas. It is true that she does not fit the cruel, superficial standards Mr. Kensington apparently requires of a spouse. However, what Mr. Fisk calls sedentary, we call focused. What Mr. Fisk calls contributing nothing, we call building everything." Joanne picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from the table. "We do not contest the existence of the post-nuptial agreement. In fact, we welcome it, because today we are going to prove that Richard Kensington did not build his empire. We're going to prove that he is nothing more than a figurehead, a charismatic salesman who is currently attempting to steal a company from its actual creator." Richard's smirk vanished. He frowned, glancing at Fisk, who waved a dismissive hand. Fisk clearly thought this was a desperate bluff from a cornered legal team. "Furthermore," Joanne added, her tone dropping to a deadly serious register, "by the end of these proceedings, the court will see that Mr. Kensington has not only perjured himself on his financial disclosures today, but has engaged in a systematic multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. And the person holding the receipts, Your Honor, is the very woman he just tried to leave destitute." Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Those are incredibly heavy accusations, Miss Clifford. You had better have the paper trail to back them up." "Oh, we do, Your Honor," Joanne replied, turning to look directly into Richard's widening eyes. "We have the architect." The courtroom air shifted. The casual arrogance that had radiated from the plaintiff's table was suddenly replaced by a rigid, hyper-alert tension. Richard's hands, previously resting casually on the table, were now clenched into tight fists. Fisk was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous slander. Opposing counsel is using opening statements to throw wild, unfounded conspiracy theories at the wall because they have no legal standing against the post-nuptial agreement." "Overruled, Mr. Fisk," Judge Harrison barked, his interest visibly piqued. "Miss Clifford, call your first witness." "The defense calls Beatrice Kensington to the stand," Joanne announced. Beatrice stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her navy dress and walked with slow, deliberate dignity toward the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. She looked out across the courtroom. When her eyes met Richard's, there was no fear, no sorrow, and no anger. There was only the cold, calculating gaze of a chess grandmaster looking at a pawn who thought he was a king. "Mrs. Kensington," Joanne began, approaching the stand, "let's start with the founding of Kensington Data Solutions. Can you tell the court what happened in the winter of 2011? Beatrice adjusted the microphone. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying easily across the silent room. "In 2011, Richard and I were living in a one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square. Richard had just been fired from his job as a regional software salesman. I was working nights as a data entry clerk to pay the rent, and spending my days coding a new predictive algorithm." "A predictive algorithm?" Joanne asked. "Can you elaborate?" Yes, it was a neural network designed to parse massive sets of unstructured consumer data and predict localized purchasing trends with a 94% accuracy rate. I called the core engine Project Oracle. Fisk snorted loudly. Objection. Relevance is the defendant claiming she invented a computer program 15 years ago as an excuse to ignore the current legal documents. Relevance would become blindingly clear in about 60 seconds, Your Honor, Joanne countered. I'll allow it. But get to the point, miss. Clifford, the judge warned. Beatrice, Joanne continued. What happened to Project Oracle? Richard saw the potential, Beatrice explained calmly. He couldn't write a single line of code, but he knew how to sell. He begged me to let him pitch it to venture capitalists. I agreed. I stayed home and continued to build and refine the architecture, while Richard took the meetings. When the first major funding round came through, Kensington Data Solutions was incorporated. Joanne walked over to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper. And who was listed as the owner of the intellectual property, the actual code at the time of incorporation? Richard was listed as the CEO of the company, Beatrice said, but he didn't own the code. Richard shot out of his chair. She's lying. I patented that software. Mr. Kensington, sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt. Judge Harrison shouted, banging his gavel. Richard slowly sank back into his chair. His face flushed red with sudden panic. Let the record show, Joanne said, handing copies of the document to the bailiff to pass to the judge and to Fisk, that the patent for the foundational algorithm powering Kensington Data Solutions was filed under a completely different entity, a holding company called Obsidian Archival. Fisk snatched the paper from the bailiff. His eyes darted rapidly across the page. Your Honor, this is an antique document. The IP was legally transferred to Kensington Data Solutions in 2015 when they went public. We have the signed transfer agreements. Yes, you do, Joanne smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. But let's look at who signed them. Beatrice, can you explain the ownership structure of Obsidian Archival? No. Obsidian Archival is an irrevocable trust, Beatrice stated, leaning slightly forward. I established it 6 months before I even married Richard. I am the sole grantor and the sole beneficiary. When Kensington Data Solutions went public, they did not buy the IP from Obsidian Archival. They licensed it. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Licensed, Joanne repeated, feigning shock. You mean to tell this court that the $800 million company your husband claims to have built from scratch doesn't actually own its core product? That is correct, Beatrice said. They lease the exclusive rights to use my code. The license is renewed every 5 years. And when does the current 5-year license expire, Mrs. Kensington? Beatrice looked directly at her husband. Her voice was like ice. Tomorrow at midnight. Richard's face went entirely white. The blood completely drained from his cheeks. He grabbed Fisk by the arm, whispering frantically, but Fisk pushed him away, staring in horror at the documents in front of him. If the company lost the license to the algorithm, their product would cease to exist. The stock would plummet to zero overnight. The board of directors would crucify Richard. Beatrice had him entirely by the throat, and he hadn't even felt her hands wrap around his neck. Your Honor, this is an ambush. Fisk stammered, scrambling to find a legal foothold. This is a separate corporate matter, and has no bearing on the post-nuptial agreement regarding their marital assets. Oh, it has everything to do with it, Mr. Fisk, Joanne countered seamlessly. Because Richard's post-nuptial agreement claims that Beatrice has forfeited her right to the company's equity due to a morality clause. But Beatrice doesn't need Richard's equity. She owns the company's oxygen. Furthermore, the post-nuptial agreement was designed to protect Richard's assets. But it seems Richard has been busy protecting his assets in other highly illegal ways. Joanne walked back to the defense table and picked up a thick, heavy box of financial ledgers. She dropped it onto the table with a loud, echoing thud because Beatrice built the entire digital infrastructure of the company, Joanne said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She retained administrative access to the back-end data servers. And while my client was sitting at home being ridiculed for her weight and her quiet lifestyle, she was monitoring the data. All of it. Joanne pulled out a red folder marked Exhibit D. In this folder, Your Honor, are wire transfer logs, encrypted emails, and offshore bank statements. They detail exactly how Richard Kensington has been systematically embezzling company funds to artificially lower the company's valuation ahead of this divorce. Fisk looked at the red folder. Then he looked at Richard. The absolute terror in his client's eyes told the ruthless lawyer everything he needed to know. They were finished. Judge Thomas R. Harrison opened the thick red folder Joanne Tifford had placed before him. The courtroom was so quiet that the crisp rustle of the heavy paper sounded like gunshots. For a full 3 minutes, the only movement in the room was the judge's eyes darting back and forth across the highlighted banking ledgers, wire transfer receipt, and printed email logs. With every page he turned, the deep lines on his forehead deepened into a scowl of pure judicial fury. At the plaintiff's table, Richard Kensington was visibly hyperventilating. The custom tailoring of his Brioni suit suddenly seemed to choke him. He had aggressively tugged at his silk tie, his polished, arrogant veneer entirely shattered. Beside him, Gregory Fisk was staring at the ceiling, his jaw tightly clenched. Fisk was a legal shark, but even sharks know when there is blood in the water. Defending an aggressive divorce was one thing. Defending a client who had actively committed perjury and multi-million-dollar financial fraud in a court of law was a fast track to disbarment. Mr. Kensington, Judge Harrison finally spoke, his voice dangerously low, stripped of any courtroom pleasantries. I am looking at a series of certified bank records showing over $14 million transferred from Kensington Data Solutions operational accounts into an LLC named Apex Consulting over the last 18 months. These transfers were completely omitted from your sworn financial disclosure affidavits submitted to this court. The judge looked up, his eyes locking onto Richard like laser sights. Care to explain what Apex Consulting is? Richard opened his mouth, but only a dry, pathetic croak came out. He looked desperately at his lawyer. Fisk didn't even turn his head. He subtly shifted his chair an inch away from his client. I can explain, Your Honor, Joanne Tifford chimed in smoothly, stepping back to the center of the floor. Apex Consulting is a shell corporation registered in the state of Delaware. It provides absolutely no goods, no services, and has no employees. Well, except for one. The registered agent and sole beneficiary of Apex Consulting is a 24-year-old fitness instructor named Chloe Bennett. A collective gasp echoed from the few clerks and stenographers in the room. Miss Bennett, Joanne continued, pacing methodically, currently resides in a $5 million penthouse on the Gold Coast. A penthouse purchased in cash by Apex Consulting. Over the past year and a half, Richard Kensington has been bleeding his own company dry, funneling venture capital and operational revenue into this shell company to hide his assets from my client in preparation for this exact divorce proceeding. He artificially deflated the value of his merit to the state while simultaneously funding his mistress. Objection, Richard suddenly screamed, slamming his hands on the table, spit flying from his lips. He completely bypassed his attorney, his face a blotchy, ugly crimson. This is illegally obtained information. Those were highly encrypted private servers. I used military-grade encryption. She hacked me. Your Honor, she committed a cybercrime. Beatrice looked at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed her own youth and ambition to elevate. For years she had endured his snide comments about her weight. She had endured his silent embarrassment when they were in public. She had stayed home, quietly absorbing the pain, letting him believe he was the master of their universe. She leaned into the microphone. I didn't hack you, Richard. Her voice was frighteningly calm. It stopped Richard's tirade instantly. In 2016, you begged me to build the company's internal cybersecurity infrastructure because you were too cheap to hire a firm out of Silicon Valley, Beatrice said, her eyes never leaving his. I built the firewalls. I built the encryption keys. And because you don't know the first thing about the technology you sell, you never realized that I retained the super administrator privileges. You never revoked my access because you didn't even know how. For 4 years, I have seen every email you thought you deleted. I have seen every offshore routing number you thought was hidden. I watched you siphon the money I helped you make and give it to a girl who was in middle school when I was writing the code that made you a billionaire. Richard stared at her, utterly paralyzed. The realization of his own profound stupidity was crashing down on him in real time. He had assumed Beatrice was complacent. Because she was heavy, because she was introverted, he had equated her physical stillness with mental slowness. He had completely forgotten that the woman sitting across from him was a certified genius. Your Honor, Fist suddenly interrupted, standing up. His voice was stiff and remarkably polite. I need to request an immediate 15-minute recess. I need to confer with my client regarding his altered legal standing. If this recess is not granted, I will be forced to formally request to withdraw as Mr. Kensington's counsel. Fisk was bailing. He knew that the moment Richard admitted to using military-grade encryption to hide the funds, he had confessed to the embezzlement on the court record. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Fisk, Judge Harrison snapped, banging his gavel. Sit down. This court is not recessing so you can figure out how to spin a multi-million-dollar fraud. Ms. Tifford, does your client have a proposed settlement, or are we referring Mr. Kensington to the district attorney's office immediately? We have a proposal, Your Honor, Joanne said, a lethal smile touching the corners of her mouth. But it is no longer the 50-50 split we originally asked for. The mud was the first thing she truly noticed, not the swaggering entremaux meet smite. Richard Kensington was slouched in his chair, a broken, terrifying shell of the arrogant CEO who had swaggered through the mahogany doors just an hour prior. Let us review the reality of the situation, Joanne stated, walking over to stand directly behind Beatrice, placing a supportive hand on her client's shoulder. Richard Kensington has violated his fiduciary duty to Kensington Data Solutions. He has committed corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and perjury. Furthermore, the core software license that allows Kensington Data Solutions to legally operate expires tomorrow at midnight. The license is solely controlled by my client, Beatrice Kensington. Joanne picked up a final, thin manila envelope from her table. At 8 o'clock this morning, Joanne continued. Before court convened, my client sent a secure encrypted data packet to David Carmichael, the chairman of the board of directors for Kensington Data Solutions. This packet contained the exact same ledgers, wire transfers, and proof of embezzlement that are currently sitting on Your Honor's desk. It also contained a formal notice of license termination from Obsidian Archival. Richard's head snapped up. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. You went to the board, he whispered, his voice cracking. I did, Beatrice answered directly, and I gave them an ultimatum. Joanne pulled a single sheet of paper from the manila envelope. The board of directors held an emergency, closed-door vote at 9:30 this morning. We have just received their signed resolution. Joanne handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Harrison. To prevent the complete evaporation of the company's stock and to distance themselves from Mr. Kensington's impending federal criminal charges, Joanne read aloud for the record, as the board has voted unanimously to terminate Richard Kensington as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. He is being stripped of his voting rights and escorted from the building by corporate security if he attempts to return. A strangled gasp escaped Richard's throat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. It was completely dark. The corporate servers had already remotely wiped and locked his device. He was locked out. He was nothing. Furthermore, Joanne added, delivering the final fatal blow, Beatrice Kensington has agreed to renew the software license with Kensington Data Solutions under one condition. The board will issue new preferred stock, granting Beatrice a 51% controlling interest in the company. She is no longer just the architect, Your Honor. She is the majority owner. Fisk let out a long, heavy sigh and closed his briefcase. The fight was over. It wasn't even a fight, it was a flawlessly executed slaughter. Regarding the divorce settlement, Joanne concluded, looking down at Richard with absolute disgust, we are enforcing the post-nuptial agreement that Mr. Kensington so desperately wanted to rely upon. We are taking the $100,000, the cabin in Wisconsin, and every single cent in his personal accounts as restitution for the marital funds he illegally funneled to his mistress. He will leave this marriage with the exact amount of wealth he had when he met Beatrice. Absolute zero. Judge Harrison looked at the documents, then looked at Richard, who was now weeping silently, his face buried in his hands. There was no pity in the judge's eyes. Mr. Kensington, Judge Harrison said, his voice ringing with finality, in my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a man dig his own grave with such arrogance and precision. I am approving the defendant's settlement terms in full. Furthermore, I am forwarding Exhibit D to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. I highly suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney, because Mr. Fisk is clearly done with you. The judge banged his gavel. Case closed. As the courtroom began to clear, Richard remained frozen in his chair, staring at the polished wood of the table. He had lost his company, his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom. Beatrice stood up. She smoothed the skirt of her modest navy blue dress. She picked up her purse and walked over to where Richard was sitting. She didn't gloat. She didn't yell. She simply looked down at the man who had tried to erase her. You spent 15 years looking at me, Richard, Beatrice said softly, her voice carrying a chilling, absolute authority. But you never actually saw me. You thought because I took up space, I had no substance. You thought silence was weakness. Richard slowly looked up at her, his eyes red and brimming with tears. Bear, please. And the wonder, he begged, his voice a pathetic whimper. Goodbye, Richard, she said. Beatrice turned her back on him and walked out of the heavy mahogany doors, her head held high, stepping out of the shadows and into the empire she had built. What an unbelievable conclusion to an absolute masterpiece of revenge. Richard thought his wife's silence was weakness, but Beatrice proved that the quietest players in the room are usually the ones holding checkmate. If you love seeing this arrogant CEO get stripped of his empire and handed exactly what he deserved, smash that like button. Share this story and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life drama.